Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into what is honestly one of modern history's greatest underdog stories. You know, when you think of the world's most powerful, wealthy cities, you probably picture gleaming skyscrapers, perfect infrastructure, maybe world-class airports. But what if I told you that just a few decades ago, one of the most iconic of these global hubs was essentially a collection of overcrowded, poor settlements? I mean, they literally had almost zero prospect for survival. So today we're unpacking the Singapore miracle, how an overcrowded island went from absolutely nothing to becoming the blueprint for the future.
Seriously, take a second and ask yourself, how do you build an entire country when you have almost nothing to work with? That was the terrifying existential question Singapore's leaders had to face right at the birth of their nation. And it wasn't just some abstract philosophical debate, right? It was a literal matter of life and death.
Now, standard global powers usually rely on some pretty obvious assets to build their wealth and influence. We're talking oil bubbling under the ground, endless acres of fertile farmland, huge domestic markets, or maybe a massive military. But back in the 1960s, Singapore had none of that. And I mean literally none. Zero natural resources, no oil, no huge market, no vast agricultural plains. Just a tiny piece of land and a whole lot of uncertainty.
To really get how grim the reality was, let's look at the timeline. In 1960, the landscape was just dominated by overcrowded, poor settlements. You had whole families crammed into tiny rooms. By 1964, things were so uncertain that a lot of experts actually believed Singapore simply couldn't survive on its own. And then 1965 happens, sudden independence from Malaysia. Now for most nations, independence is this huge, joyous celebration. But for Singapore, it was terrifying. They were suddenly entirely on their own, totally cut off, stuck on an overcrowded island.
So, we enter Phase 1, building basic dignity.
Where do you even begin when the odds are stacked that high against you? Well, you can't stabilize a nation if its people are living in unsafe, unsanitary conditions. So the government rolled out this incredibly methodical blueprint. Step 1, slowly and deliberately clear out the slums. Step 2, build proper, sturdy public housing flats. But Step 3 is the absolute game changer here. They didn't just throw up isolated housing blocks. They created entire, functioning, modern neighborhoods. Schools, markets, running water, electricity, the whole shebang. They essentially took the country out of pure survival mode and engineered real community living at a speed you rarely ever see.
There's this quote, "A strong country begins with basic dignity." And think about what that actually means on a human level. Moving a family from a crowded, unsafe wooden shack into a proper apartment, that changes absolutely everything. Kids can finally study in a safe space, commuting gets easier, communities actually get organized. It completely shifted the psychology of the entire population from this daily panic to an actual sense of order and possibility. You just can't build a massive economy without that stable foundation.
Which brings us to Phase 2, the economic engine.
Okay, so with housing stabilized, the next massive hurdle was just plain survival. How do you feed people when you have absolutely nothing to sell? No timber, no minerals. Well, they made a really radical pivot. While other newly independent nations back then were closing their borders to protect themselves, Singapore did the exact opposite. They focused on ports, factories, industrial zones, international companies, and banks. They took their geographic location, right near major global sea routes, and made it their ultimate superpower. They vigorously welcomed foreign investment and made business safe, easy, and super fast for foreigners. Basically, they transformed what was a huge geographic vulnerability into a massive global trading hub. But here's the thing, capital and ports are totally useless if you don't have a workforce to run them, right? So what exactly were Singapore's natural resources? The answer was simply the people. Since they couldn't just pull gold or oil out of the ground, the government realized the citizens themselves had to become the nation's greatest asset. They poured intense focus into education and skills. Students were rigorously trained. Workers were constantly upskilled. The government deeply ingrained discipline, productivity, and long-term thinking into the workforce. And it worked. The people literally became the high-value resource that foreign companies desperately wanted to hire.
And that sets the stage for Phase 3, the master plan.
You know, an economic boom of this sheer scale doesn't just manage itself. It requires an almost obsessive level of organization. We're talking about the deliberate physical design of the nation so that rapid growth wouldn't just collapse into total chaos. Most cities around the world grow organically, which kind of just means they grow randomly. But not Singapore. They asked the hard questions early on. Where should people live? Where should the businesses go? What about the roads, parks, schools, transit? And they mapped it all out years in advance.
It takes incredible foresight to look at an empty space and know exactly how it's going to serve a dense population decades down the line. That's exactly why the city feels so different today. It's not just rich, it's deeply, deeply organized. And this obsessive structure went way beyond just roads and buildings. It extended to absolute societal trust. Clean streets, protected public spaces, strictly enforced rules, and maybe most crucially, a zero-tolerance policy for corruption. The government treated corruption like the ultimate enemy of progress. And why? Because strict rules and clean governance create trust. When people trust the system, they invest their time, they work harder. And when massive international companies trust that the rules are fair and their money is completely safe, they pour billions into the economy. Trust isn't just a nice societal perk. It is quite literally the ultimate economic multiplier.
And boy, did that trust pay off spectacularly. If you trace the decades, the transformation is just staggering. In 1965, it was a struggling, resource-poor island just trying to survive the shock of sudden independence. Fast forward to the 1980s, the slums are rapidly vanishing, modern estates are rising up, and Singapore is suddenly this formidable, rising Asian economic star. Then hit the 1990s, it's completely transformed into a globally dominant city. We are talking world-class airports, one of the busiest seaports on the planet, an incredible education system, and that iconic, wealthy skyline. From sheer survival to absolute supremacy in just a few short decades. It's wild.
Which brings us to our final section, the ultimate lesson. This breathtaking transformation did not happen by accident. It wasn't luck, and it definitely wasn't some magic trick. It was the result of incredibly stark, deliberate, and sometimes really difficult choices. Singapore chose planning over chaos. They chose rigorous education over making excuses about their lack of resources. They chose clean governance over the easy, destructive path of corruption, global trade over isolation, and above all, they chose long-term discipline over short-term comfort. Every single one of these choices took immense, unwavering focus. Now, history shows this rapid rise wasn't perfectly smooth. It came with intense pressure, strict rules, and real challenges along the way. But the sheer scale of the turnaround, it absolutely remains one of the most remarkable engineered success stories in modern history.
Ultimately, a profound truth emerges here that kind of challenges how we view the whole world today. A country does not need to be large to become powerful. The Singapore miracle proves that unwavering vision, rigorous discipline, and the courage to build for a future before it even arrives completely outrank physical size. It really makes you wonder, what other impossible limitations are just waiting for the right master plan? Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.